A terror suspect on the run after breaking out of jail. Can the Prime Minister escape from a week of bad news? With a manhunt underway but no sightings, the Justice Secretary says he'll leave no stone unturned to find General Khalif. The opposition blame the government for a crumbling prison system. And the Chief Inspector of Prisons tells the Politics Hub that Wandsworth Prison should be shut down. Chris Pincher, the former Conservative MP who played a leading role in the downfall of Boris Johnson, quits after losing his appeal against an 8-week suspension over groping allegations. Will this lead to another by-election meltdown for Rishi Sunak? New figures show Labour and the Conservatives building huge election war chests. We'll show you how you can keep track of who's pumping money into politics. All that and more with our panel, Fiona Hill and Flint, who are here to give their take for the next hour. It's Thursday. I'm Sophy Ridge, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. It sounds like a plot from a film. A trained soldier, last seen dressed in a chef's outfit, on the run after escaping jail by clinging to the bottom of a food delivery van. A manhunt's now underway, and there's, of course, an immediate inquiry into how on earth this was allowed to happen. But on tonight's show, I want to look at the politics, because in many ways it's a freak event. A daring prison escape, a police hunt across the country. I mean, this kind of thing doesn't happen very often. But just like the school concrete crisis, it's allowed the opposition to shine a light on 13 years of Conservative spending. I spoke earlier this week about how spending on infrastructure and capital budgets wasn't sexy. Well, compared to prisons, that's the most glamorous expenditure ever. No politician's going to win votes going into an election promising more taxpayers' cash for prisoners. So maybe that is why the prison and probation resource budget is still 6% lower in real terms than in 2010. Is this escape because of Conservative cuts to the prison budget? We don't know. Maybe not. But the problem for Rishi Sunak is people will think that it could be. So that's the politics that we are going to get stuck into on the Politics Hub, as you'd expect. But first, of course, let's get the latest on the manhunt. Sajid Chowdhury is at Wandsworth Prison for us. Any sightings?
Well, we're coming up to about 36 hours now since Daniel Khalif escaped from this prison, clinging on to the bottom of a delivery food truck. And over 150 officers have been involved. That's the latest update we've got from the Met, saying that over 150 officers have been involved trying to figure out what happened and where he may be. We've heard in the last hour from the commander in charge of this investigation, Dominic Murphy. Have a listen to what he said.
Nothing is off the table here. We will do everything we can to find him wherever that takes us in the country. We have some of the highest trained military in the world here in the UK, and Daniel Khalif was trained by the UK military. He will be a resourceful individual, and that's important for us to remember when we're trying to find him. But we will be committed to that. We know a lot about him, so we'll use that information to try and help us find him.
Well, police are appealing for witnesses to come forward if anyone has any information. Just a reminder of some of those key details. The van left the gates behind me outside the prison at 7:32 in the morning. The police were then called at 8:15 and the vehicle was eventually stopped at 8:37, so over an hour after it left here. So anyone who knows anything or has any information, the police are asking them to get in touch. And all this after the Justice Secretary this morning announced that there will be an independent inquiry into what happened.
Sajid, thank you very much indeed. Sajid there giving us the latest update on that ongoing manhunt. Let's talk now about the politics of the story, shall we? Our political correspondent, Mari Aurora, is here. First time on the Politics Hub.
Very exciting.
Welcome. Lovely to have you here. How much of a headache is this for the Prime Minister?
It's a huge headache for the Prime Minister for several reasons. First of all, the fact that Alex Chalk, Justice Secretary, just got, finding his feet on the job, and this kind of disaster has happened straight away on his watch. Not a great look. But also, there's always a risk of incompetence, and that's what Labour are trying to brand it as. So we now have a situation where Alex Chalk has said there's going to be an independent inquiry into this and exactly how this has actually happened. The Labour Party trying to say it's a Tory mess, it's Tory incompetence, but at the same time, the risk for the Labour Party by trying to, use this as an attack line is actually these figures when it comes to prison escapes weren't that great under Labour either. They did improve, but they still weren't that great, and therefore the Tories do have a bit of a rebuttal when it comes to this. Now, If you look at public perception when it comes to prisoners, this is the other thing that we need to remember. When it comes to funding for the Ministry of Justice, we have a situation where there was a poll in 2021 from YouGov. 50% of the people who were polled said that they felt living conditions for prisoners was too easy. Only 8% said they felt it was too harsh. So there isn't a lot of public sympathy for prisoners, and therefore trying to get more funding to improve living conditions or reduce overcrowding is actually quite difficult for a Justice Secretary. So the risk for Rishi Sunak really is we have sewage overflowing in our rivers, we have schools crumbling, we have NHS waiting lists still very high, no real sign of stopping the boats, and now we have someone escaping from prison. So the risk is they look like they're not very good at running the country.
Yeah, and as you say, hard to argue, isn't it, for more money for prisons when hospitals, schools, all of these other things.
Everybody wants more cash.
Everyone wants more cash, exactly. Mari, great to have you on the show. Thank you. Well, our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, has been looking at the latest setback in the Rishi reset.
First week back, and the problems have been piling up for government. Each prompts a similar refrain.
The vast majority of schools in our country do not have RAG.
It is very rare for prisoners to escape.
Will you get better performance out of this?
The tone set by the man in the driving seat, arguing that the escape of a terror suspect from Wandsworth jail is a one-off.
These incidences are extremely rare. The Justice Secretary has initiated already an internal inquiry into the specific circumstances around this particular individual and this case.
You've got to get this absolutely right every time.
The job of the opposition now to paint the picture of a country creaking after 13 years of spending pressure and political turmoil.
There were already some pretty damning reports into Wandsworth, issues about staffing, issues about buildings, and that's a pattern of behaviour now under this government, whether it's this prison or other prisons or other infrastructure across the country. And it certainly hasn't helped that in the last 10 years we've had 10 Justice Secretaries.
Thank you.
This is the 10th Justice Secretary in a decade, in charge today of handling the unfolding crisis. He insists that staffing wasn't the issue. It was a problem of prison officers not following the rules.
The positions were staffed. The security posts were occupied. The question is whether protocols applied.
MPs on all sides unsure.
Shockingly, only 7 prison officers turned up for a night shift last December to cover 1,500 inmates.
It's a matter of record that there is an issue with staffing at Wandsworth and that there is an issue across the prison service with retaining experienced staff.
Prison numbers too growing quickly. The current capacity of the prison system in England and Wales stands at just over 88,000. And this is the prison population as it stands, just short of being full. The government's own forecasters see a big jump in the need for prison places in coming years. But will there be cash to help relieve the pressure in future?
As hard as Labour tries, you can't actually directly link the escapee from Wandsworth Jail to the political turmoil or funding squeezes of the last few years. But Tory MPs are nevertheless very nervous. This is a blot on the law and order copybook. They know there's a perception that prison budgets have been squeezed, and nothing since last week's reset seems to have gone well for Rishi Sunak.
After feeling the heat this week, Rishi Sunak now flies to India to meet with world leaders. Will temperatures in here have cooled by the time he returns? Sam Coates, Sky News, Westminster.
Sam Coates there on the kind of political implications of all this. Now, earlier I spoke to Charlie Taylor, who is the Chief Inspector of Prisons, and my first question to him was how on earth this was allowed to happen.
Well, it's enormously concerning, and I think one of the reasons maybe, and again, we don't know the details of this case yet, but one of the reasons may be to do with staffing levels at Wandsworth. And certainly we know this has been a huge concern in our recent inspections of that jail, and actually a number of other jails around the country. And if you haven't got enough staff to be able to get the basics right, there is always a danger that people will drop the ball and make a mistake. And when it comes to things like security, it tends to be just about having really good routines. So I do X, you do Y, we make sure these checks are done. But of course, if there aren't enough staff in place, and that's something we flag up a lot, then things can just begin to go a bit wrong.
It's interesting you're mentioning concerns you've previously flagged, because I just want to read a bit of your report into Wandsworth. It was done in 2021, published last year, and this is what you wrote. Leaders in this crumbling, overcrowded, vermin-infested prison will need considerable ongoing support from the prison service, notably with the recruitment and retention of staff, as you point out, and also improving the infrastructure of the jail. I mean, that is damning.
It is, and Wandsworth was built 170 years ago. It's a very old jail, one of the oldest in the country. It is in a real state. It wasn't built to hold nearly as many men who are locked up there as they are now. So, large proportion of prisoners are locked in cells that were originally designed for one person. They're locked in with someone else. It's a sort of 12 by 6 cell, roughly 12 foot by 6. There's an unscreened toilet in the corner of the room. Their food is served to them in the room as well. And often they're spending up to 22 hours a day locked up in that very tight environment. On top of that, we're seeing things like drugs finding their way into prisons in large numbers. And what that creates is an illicit economy that then often is the cause of things like violence, people to get into debt and those sorts of issues.
And that's happening in Wandsworth, you think?
And that's an ongoing issue in every prison. Some are worse than others, but Wandsworth certainly is a jail that's always been difficult to keep drugs out of.
So there's drugs and mobile phones in every prison, is what you're saying?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you talk about the staffing levels and the concern about staffing levels, what does that mean? What impact does that have on places like Wandsworth?
Well, when we inspected Wandsworth, there were, I think, 30% of staff were unavailable for full duties. So whether they were off sick or whether they were on restricted duties, but that reduced the complement of staff who were available enormously. And what that means is that prisoners don't get unlocked on time. It means that prisoners aren't escorted to where they need to go, so they don't get escorted to things like education. But it also means that some of the basics just don't get done. So making sure people have got soap, making sure that people have got a duvet cover, those sorts of things that they need.
It's extraordinary. Yeah.
It is a huge concern, and inevitably when that happens, you get difficulties.
And you lose control, I guess, of the prison.
And there's a danger of losing control. I mean, generally, prisons are very cautious about letting people out of their cells, and that's what we've been seeing at Wandsworth. Because they haven't got enough staff to escort people out, people are just locked up in their cells for long periods of time. But the issue, Sophie, is that these people are coming out one day. And the idea that you're rehabilitating people by banging them up behind a door for 22 hours a day is just simply fanciful.
I think a lot of people will be wondering, why was this individual, a suspected terrorist, in a Category B prison? I mean, no one's ever escaped from Belmarsh. Should he be put it there?
Well, again, we'll see what happens. The Secretary of State has asked for an inquiry, particularly into why that decision was made. And so I wouldn't be able to be sure about why that was. Certainly we know that some lower-level terrorist suspects could be held in Category B prisons. They wouldn't always necessarily go to Belmarsh, but in the case of that individual, I don't know.
Is there a link between, as some would say, this escape and a lack of funding in prisons?
Well, it's hard to make that link very directly, but if prisons haven't got enough staff, if you've got prisoners who are being locked up for long periods of time, they're not getting to education, they're not getting to work and those sorts of things, there is a danger that these sorts of things happen. So can we say this is directly to do with funding? Well, that's probably difficult. But actually, if there aren't enough staff, sometimes that is very much a funding issue.
More widely on funding, and I'm quite interested to get your take on this, because, to be honest, I interview politicians. Labour politicians will say, look, there is a problem with funding. The Tory austerity years cut budgets. If you speak to the Conservatives, they'll say, well, actually, funding's risen dramatically in the last few years, so that's not a concern. What is the truth?
Well, when you find a prison like Wandsworth, it really needs closing, ultimately. It's not a suitable prison to be...
You should shut down...
housing people in...
You'd shut down Wandsworth, that's
well, in an ideal world, one would, but of course, you need jails because you need to service the courts. We've actually got a crisis at the moment in prisons just in terms of population places. So there are only just enough prisons, places available at the moment for the number of prisoners who are coming in. And, of course, that puts a huge strain on the system. So in a jail like Wandsworth, you're getting people in, you're getting them to court, you're getting them back from court, and then as soon as they've been sentenced, they're being moved on to another jail as quickly as possible. And it's something about that churn that also adds to the general complications and sometimes what feels like chaos in some of those big local prisons like Wandsworth.
What's your take on funding specifically?
Well, it's interesting on funding because we inspected a children's prison called Cook and Wood earlier on this year, and we were enormously concerned by very high levels of violence. The fact that I think 20 22, 23 of the boys in the jail were being kept in effect, what was solitary confinement. I mean, absolutely shocking. And there are only 77 boys in the jail. There are 350 staff in there. So
what kind of violence were you seeing?
Well, lots of weapon making. So what had happened is that the boys themselves were feeling unsafe. Staff were backing off and failing to do some of the things they ought to have been doing. For example, making sure that searches were conducted. And what that meant was that they were creating weapons and those weapons were being used. And I'll just give you one example. There was a boy we came across who'd cut the plug off his kettle. Now, the reason for doing that is you put the plug into a socket and it can then be used as a weapon. But in that particular jail, instead of conducting what you would normally do, which would be a full search, find that plug, make sure that it was dealt with, that actually all they did was just gave him another kettle. So he had a serviceable kettle and he had a serviceable weapon at the same time.
So they didn't take the weapon away?
So they didn't find the weapon until much later on, and that was happening a lot. So makeshift weapons being made. But that was in a jail which had 23 senior leaders in the prison that had only 77 boys being locked up. But elsewhere we go to, like prisons like Wandsworth, we also inspected Bristol recently. And again, that was a prison where they were really struggling with prisoners who were hugely high levels of drug taking, hugely high levels of need, mental health difficulties, homelessness, that sort of cycle of offending that people get caught into. And again, Bristol was an enormously violent place and very risky. And again, it was rife with drugs.
Interesting. Do you think there's an issue with politicians not prioritising prisons? It's never going to be a vote winner. Oh, we're going to spend lots of money on locking people up. We've had a huge churn in justice secretaries as well. Is that a problem?
Well, I think political churn, I think, is always something that feeds into some of the challenges here. I think it's difficult because if you ask people would they like more money spent on the NHS or on schools or on roads or money to be spent on prisons, I think it's fairly obvious what the answer would be. People don't like prisoners much and they're frightened of crime. However, if we do want people to come out from prisons, and prisons have got a critical duty here in terms of public protection, if we want people to come out from prison and to stop offending, then we need to do more for them while they're locked up. And that means giving them the skills they need. It means putting them on the right sort of programmes. It means getting them into the good habits of work. So when they come out, they don't create more victims. They don't cause trouble in their communities. And they take their place back into society as hard-working, tax-paying people. But at the moment, what we're seeing is just that churn, that revolving door of people in and out of prison, often for many, many years.
I found that interview fascinating, actually, just hearing someone just talking so openly about what is going on in prisons. We can bring in now the former Downing Street Chief of Staff, Fiona Hill, and the former Labour Minister and MP, Caroline Flint. What a perfect day to have both of you on the show. You, of course, worked with the former Home Secretary, Theresa May, for many years, and Caroline, you were a minister in the Home Office as well. So I'm really interested to get your thoughts on this story. Fiona, is this a freak event, or does it tell us something about the state of our prisons?
I think it is a freak event. I think that he's a young man who has military experience. That probably gives him a level of cunning. He was working in a kitchen, which meant that he knew that the delivery van was coming in and out, and he took his opportunity. But the one thing to say is that no one in this room can understand, and actually you'll remember this, Caroline, from your time in the Home Office, the real story that is happening on the submissions that are going into the Secretary of State, we can't know.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with not very much detail. Is there a problem in our prisons? Well, you know, in terms of how you cut up the public services pie, you know, there have been moments, I think, that prisons have taken a bit of a hit. Certainly when we were in coalition and we did the austerity measures, I was at the Home Office, obviously different from Justice, but at the end of the day, prison is a deterrent. So if you're writing policies on how you reduce crime, you have to bake that into your policy-making thinking. So we live in a world of competing priorities.
Do you think that the austerity years went too far when it came to cuts in, you know, the Home Office and the prisons budget?
Well, Sophie, I would say that because I spent most of my time fighting for more money, because that's what you do when you're in a department, and everyone in their respective departments do precisely that.
And what did the Treasury say?
The Treasury are very, very good at saying no.
Yeah, and I guess this is almost the theme of the week, isn't it? Like you say, it's important not to draw too many direct links because we don't know the details of the
I think the key thing for me is not to make it political. It is an operational event. He will be found. I mean, I have every faith in our police and in our intelligence that he will be found. But it's not necessarily about politics. I understood what you were saying earlier, that you can lift this up and see, well, is this part of a bigger pattern of, I guess, ability to be seen to run a country? Well, the truth is, it's difficult to run a country. It's difficult to run a big business. And there will be things that will go wrong. The difference, of course, when you are a Prime Minister is that when things go wrong, everyone knows about it because it's reported.
Caroline, what's your take? Do you agree with Fiona that this is a one-off, this was a guy who took his opportunity and escaped? Or do you think that actually, look, we should talk about things like staffing, about how this was able to happen?
I think that he's not the first, and he probably won't be the last person to escape from prison. I had 3 prisons in my constituency, one an open establishment. We actually had people, you know, in the community from the open prisons, and sometimes they absconded and they had to come back. However, where I might disagree with you gently, Fiona, is that you said yourself, this guy was a trained soldier. He is in there waiting to go to court on charges of terrorism. That, I think, would have, for me, maybe just set the alarm bells going about which sort of establishment he should be placed in. And there are places that probably might have been more appropriate for a man of his ingenuity, to say the least. Having said that, on any given day, when traffic's coming in and out of prisons and delivery trucks for kitchens, whether you've got someone who's a trained soldier or not, you expect a level of security operating there. So we'll have to wait to see what the investigation says, but it will then draw to attention what is happening within the justice system, what's happening in the prison estate. And the fact is that, you know, I would say in 2010, in a lot of our public services, cuts were going to have to be made because of where we were in terms of the financial crisis. We all had to tighten our belt. But I think, as we said at the time, a number of these cuts were quite short-sighted. I think they were far too deep. They were far too fast. And what a series of prime ministers, Tory prime ministers, have had to deal with is having to see how they can shore up the gaps and the vacuums that have been created. So we have had in the last few years a surge to try and recruit more prison officers, but we've lost a lot of experienced prison officers, and the turnover rate of those being recruited is huge. So there are real issues there.
I mean, that is true. I do agree with you on that, Caroline. But going back again to the situation at hand, we can't know how many officers were manning him or any. I mean, you know, it might be really bad and he didn't have any. I just simply don't know.
It was interesting, though, wasn't it, to hear in the interview the Chief Inspector of Prisons there. He said Wandsworth should be shut down. Yeah. I mean, I was quite taken aback by that.
Likewise.
Yeah.
There is a lot.
It's a big statement.
That's a big statement.
There's probably a lot of our prison estate is just not fit for purpose. And this is not about, you know, cushy en-suites or anything like this. They're not fit for living conditions, they're not fit for working conditions, they're not fit necessarily for providing the sort of rehabilitation activities that you might want, because at some point, most of these prisoners are going to come out. And, you know, the plan is to build more prisons. I read a statistic, Sophie, that we've got 86,000 prisoners in England and Wales. That is due to rise by 2025, 26 to something like 100,000. They reckon it's going to peak at 106,000. And the plans are to build more prisons for more places. But at the moment, the government's falling short on that. Now, whoever wins the next election, it isn't the most popular issue for the public, but the public do believe in prison and they do believe that they should be safe from those who might seek to escape.
Yeah, it's another big theme of the week, almost the challenges for whoever it is, you know, who is in power after the election, Labour or the Conservatives. Really interesting to talk to you both on this issue. Still to come on the Politics Hub this evening. As the parties gear up for that coming election, fundraising is in overdrive. We'll reveal how you can keep track of how much they're spending and, crucially, who's giving them the money. Our exclusive and award-winning Westminster Accounts is next.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
Well, there's a real sense now that people are beginning to expect that this whole airlift is coming to an end, and they're really, really desperate. We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people and putting them into trucks. You either live and recover, or you die.
Okay, so that's like a war.
That's the war, yes.
We help you understand the world with us.
Over the past 24 hours, the soldiers have been attacked on a number of occasions. It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change. We've been crushed.
We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world.
They were convinced the United States would become hooked. Well, they were right.
An enormous explosion has just come down. I think it was a monster's just landed in between us. The information on this could bring down the entire network, not just in Iraq and Syria, but across the world.
It's not out of control, but they've withdrawn. It's so hot.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. We are your source for all of the day's political news and analysis. Now, I'm here at our physical harbour, reflection of the Sky website that we are named after, with all the kind of key points of the day that you can find there. And we can take a look now at some of today's highlights that you can catch up with right now. Now, this story, we've been talking a lot about the difficulties for the government on the show, haven't we? But there was a bit of good news for them to shout about today, because the EU, the UK, I should say, is going to rejoin the EU's £85 billion science research programme. It's called Horizon. Now, some would see this as an example of Rishi Sunak improving relationships with the EU after, shall we say, a more fractious period when Boris Johnson was leader. Next story, let's have a look at this one. So here we are, Sam Coates first broke that story. This is his analysis, that despite the financial benefits, there is a bit of political risk for Rishi Sunak in rejoining Horizon. Now, this is what we showed you on the Politics Hub yesterday. It's a great tool. It's our pledge tracker. So our Rishi Sunak pledge tracker. Is he meeting his famous 5 pledges on education, immigration, the economy? Well, you can find out here. You can click through on all of the different pledges. Our Politics Hub team are keeping it constantly updated. Speaking of useful tools, this is Westminster Accounts, our landing page, and our team at Sky News, working with Tortoise Media, actually won an award last night for it. Now, what this is all about is it allows you to search for any MP and kind of delve into where the money in politics is coming from and who is benefiting from it as well. Plus, if you scan the QR code, you can catch up with all of the latest on the Hub throughout the day. Now, let's bring in Sam Coates, shall we, at this point, who's standing by for us. Money in politics. Firstly, congratulations on the award. You probably can't say it yourself, but I can say it. Sam, big part of the Westminster Accounts team that won that award, so congratulations. But we've had some more information coming in, haven't we, about election war chests. What's going on?
Well, the reason that we look at money in politics, the reason that we did Westminster Accounts, is that you actually learn quite a lot about what's going on under the bonnet if you do study the figures. Now, every 3 months you get a download from the Electoral Commission, the kind of elections watchdog, about who's giving money to political parties. Today is that day. We've just got the figures for April to June, and £24 million has been given to the main parties over that period. And it tells you that politics is returning really to just like it was in 2014, 2015, probably the last time that you guys were on the panel were fighting elections. And what it tells us is that the Conservatives, just barely a year after Liz Truss, are back on the front foot when it comes to campaigning. They've raised just under 10 million in that period.
It's quite surprising that they've raised that amount of money. Were you surprised by that? Or?
Well, I think it was unusual that there was such a flight away from the Conservative Party, but I think almost everything about what happened a year ago was unusual.
Laughter there from the panellists. It's one way of putting it, Sam.
To put it lightly. But another unusual thing is that Labour have raised almost about a comparable sum, which doesn't always happen, almost 7.5 million. And the vast bulk isn't coming from the unions. It's coming from a couple of large donors, Lord Sainsbury, who was a Labour donor in the new Labour years, and the former head of Autoglass is given a couple of million, but will give another 3 or 4 million before the election, he says. Lib Dems only on 1.5 million. £25,000 from Nick Clegg. Now, I don't think that's going on Liberal Democrat leaflets. They don't seem to mention him ever these days, but it's a little bit in general of this thing of a reversion to the, as it were, norm of politics after 8 years of complete insanity. We're sort of winding back to the way things were in 2014, 2015.
Yes, it's really interesting to hear. And, of course, money matters when it comes to elections as well, right? Sam, thanks very much indeed. Sam Coates there. There you go. Found you. Still to come on the Politics Hub. Chris Pincher will stand down after losing his appeal against a suspension over groping allegations. And that means another by-election battle for the Conservatives against a backdrop of sleeve. Do they have a chance of holding the seat? Find out next. Hello, welcome back. This is the Politics Hub, where each night we give you a front row seat on all of the day's political drama. Now, we've been talking a lot this week about crumbling Britain and the government's record running and funding public services. But I just want to shift gears now and talk about conduct in our political system, because I have a very clear memory of Rishi Sunak's first speech on the steps of Downing Street when he'd just been made Prime Minister. And he promised, in his words, to have integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level. Now, that was after a series of scandals about the behaviour of politicians, not just Conservatives, I should add, that culminated with the Chris Pincher scandal, which contributed to the downfall of Boris Johnson, not actually Partygate. Chris Pincher was the trigger there. Now, today, the Tamworth MP stood down after losing his appeal against an 8-week suspension over groping allegations. That means there'll now be a by-election, which, if recent history is something to go by, could provide another night of election pain for the Prime Minister. Now, he gave his reaction earlier.
Midterm by-elections are always difficult for incumbent governments, and these will be no different, but we're going to keep working hard to deliver for the British people. I've set out 5 priorities at the beginning of the year to halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt, cut waiting lists and stop the bloats. Those are the right priorities, those are the British people's priorities, and we are determined to deliver on them and show the country that we can transform their lives and their families' lives for the better.
Well, that was Rishi Sunak, but who really matters? The voters in Tamworth. Lisa Dowd went there today for us to test the public mood.
It's not been handled very well at all. I think he should have gone and had the decency and gone months ago, but I don't think it'll affect the way I vote now.
I mean, I don't want to tar all the Conservatives with his brush, but, you know, no, I wouldn't trust any... No, I wouldn't vote Conservative again. Certainly. Well, I mean, would anybody with that sort of disgusting behaviour going on, really?
It took so long for him to stand down. By-election would be good, get somebody else in and hopefully put some generation back into the town. Because no, the town's just dying, so we need somebody else.
So that's what we found when we went out and about in Tamworth, but we can also, of course, look at the wider polls. Carl Shaven is with the pollsters Survation. Great to have you on the programme today. I thought I'd kind of do the two by-elections that are coming up. First, of course, the Chris Pincher seat, but also the Nadine Dorries seat too. 2 by-elections looming. The first one, Tamworth. So I think we can have a quick look at the 2019 election results in Tamworth. I mean, in any normal world, this would be a stonking great majority, a safe seat for the Conservatives. Is that right?
It would be in a normal world, but it's not going to be. So at Survation, we do internal modelling on every constituency in the country. And our current internal modelling for this particular seat would predict that this will be a Labour victory. Now, just to balance that is our modelling is for a general election. So for a by-election, however, we think that it's more likely to be in Labour's favour than a general election because of the context with which the by-election is being fought.
And by context, you mean the Chris Pincher scandal, right? That's the context, I guess.
Yes.
That voters were thinking about.
Yes.
It's a bit complicated as well because this seat isn't... So it's going to be merged, isn't it? Is that right, the next election? So it's a bit of are people going to be voting for the Conservative candidate for just a year until we have a general election and they're going to get a new MP after that?
There are some changes with the neighbouring seat,
yeah,
but I don't think that is going to have a significant impact on this by-election.
Yeah, so, we're looking at a Labour victory there. Extraordinary.
No, I think our forecast suggests Labour are the favourites to win this seat.
You can be very careful. I appreciate the caution. Very sensible. Politics, we never know what's going to happen.
No.
Mid-Bedfordshire, this is the Nadine Dorries constituency. And again, in a normal world, this would be a safe seat. How do you think this one's going to go?
This one is more complicated. So, really, the 3 main parties could win this seat, and each of the 3 main parties have a reasonable chance of winning this seat. Again, our internal modelling suggests that Labour are the favourites for this seat. One of the big issues with this seat is that Labour and the Liberal Democrats have been having a fight over who is the main challenger to the Conservatives. There has been very limited data and evidence about who is in the lead, but from what we know, and with the absence of counter evidence, we believe Labour are the main challenger and so are probably the favourites to win this
You better
seat.
tell our Davey that, because I spoke to him earlier this week and he was like, Labour, you know, they need to, you know, give up the ghost. It's going to be the Lib Dems.
He would say that.
He would say that. Fair enough, fair enough. Thank you very much for the analysis. I'm not going to hold you to any of it, but it's just really interesting to see just how the electoral picture is changing. Thank you. Well, let's get the thoughts now of our panel. Fiona Hill, former Downing Street Chief of Staff to Theresa May, and the former Labour MP and Minister Caroline Flint. 2 by-elections coming up. I mean, it is extraordinary times, isn't it, where, you know, what, 10,000, 20,000 majority is no longer a safe seat. I mean, you know a lot about fighting
Yeah, no,
safe
absolutely.
seats.
I mean, interesting about Tamworth, what is it? It's about 19,000 majority. From 97 to 2010, we won it 3 times. And then we lost it from 2010, and it's been in the Conservatives family since then. Let's see what will happen. It's a big ask, actually, you know, for Labour to overturn such a large majority, but they did it in Selby, and so it will be interesting to see how this plays out. But in some respects, you know, Labour will be going out all to win, but the fact that they're challenging, the fact that the challenge is on here, whatever else happens, Labour will take heart from that.
What's the mood like in the Conservative Party? I mean, there must be a lot of MPs who are like, looking at this, predictions of, you know, mid-beds of Tamworth, and be thinking, oh, my goodness me, I need to look at a new career.
Well, I mean, they've been in power in some form for a long time, really. And obviously in 2019, there was a big rush of very new MPs that came into Parliament or went into Parliament. I mean, obviously I don't work there anymore, but I can only assume that it's tough being a Conservative MP right now. I do actually think after the Uxbridge by-election results, it gave Number 10 a spring in their step, and rightly so. They found a dividing line, which I think will actually end up being a dividing line when we get to the general election campaign.
This is the ULEZ, the Sadiq Khan.
It is just a wider transition and what it means for household costs and disruption for everyday people in their households. They've not had to do that before. It's a big deal. You're asking a lot of some old people. You're asking a lot of... Anyway, I could go on.
Yeah.
It's my current obsession.
Yeah.
But, yeah, going back to where we are, I mean, of course you don't want to by-elections at this stage.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think that what Rishi said earlier is true. I think he is genuinely an honourable person. And I think he's the kind of person who'll just think, right, I've got a problem. I'll get up every day, rather, and just keep on it. And he's got a good team behind him. So, who knows?
I mean, whatever happens in a by-election and the conditions around it, you cannot, you know, rest on your laurels that the same is going to happen at a general election because, you know, it can be a really different set of circumstances. And I think what also came across from, you know, some of the people that were interviewed actually in Tamworth was just that sort of weariness about politics. And that's really sad. And, you know, we've had a lot of MPs, you know, not just on the Tory side, who, you know, on one level, it's a positive thing that the tightening of the rules, the investigations that are going on in terms of what we could maybe call Parliament's Me Too moment, they are having an effect. And people like Christopher Pincher are being called out on it, but there are others. There are 15 independent MPs because they've lost the whips of their party. Apart from a few of them, most of them have had those whips removed because of bullying or sexual misconduct. And so sleaze doesn't, you know, just affect one party. It's a plague on all your houses.
It's right. It's interesting as well because, I mean, like you guys, I've been around kind of Westminster for quite a long time, and you just see, for me, it feels like we see these stories come around every couple of years, and everyone is like really sort of appalled, and everyone says something has to be done, and then change needs to happen. And then you're like, OK, well, so what change is going to happen? And then everyone goes a bit quiet, and then nothing really changes, and then 2 years you get more allegations going. I kind of find it a bit depressing.
Well, look, I mean, unlike Caroline, I wasn't an MP.
Yeah.
So I'm slightly once removed. And it's always been my opinion that the structure of Parliament allows for this to happen. So if you, for example, if you think of a big government department, there's a very pronounced HR offering within that department. In Parliament, it's almost like a bunch of little mini businesses with all different little cultures. So there's no consistent, operating mandate for what is permissible and what is not.
Yeah. I think it's, I mean, let's be honest about it. You know, the sort of things that some of these MPs, and particularly the male ones in relation to sexual misconduct, and I think all of them on that charge are men. I think there's a few women MPs in terms of bullying of their staff that have also had complaints. But this isn't something just in politics. I think where power exists, whether it's in the creative industries, whether it's in the CBI or anywhere else, even when you have very sophisticated human resources, nobody having their little business thing set up, these things happen. Where I think it really jars with the public is about what they expect of politicians, but also the hypocrisy of politicians presenting one face and then really that is not what's going on behind the scenes.
It's really interesting to talk to you both. We are out of time, but I just, like, the point you make on power I think is really important. Anything that I've, and I haven't experienced anything, really, really terrible, but any kind of inappropriate comments or stuff was right at the beginning of my career when I didn't have very much power, and now I feel like I have more, authority, and everything changes.
Well, curiously, actually, Sophie, I feel that mine is the opposite way round.
Really? That is interesting, isn't it?
We should have more of a talk about this.
Yeah.
a different programme, I think.
Different programme.
Really interesting. Thank you so much for, talking about it. I just want to bring you a bit of a taste of what public figures and politicians sometimes have to deal with when they're out and about mixing with the public. Now, we just had a very serious conversation there, but this is a spoiler. It's not the most serious bit, this, so don't worry. They're not always treated very nicely, though. And now today was the turn of the Ryanair boss, Michael O'Leary. He was in Brussels to announce his firm's winter schedule when he came face-to-face with a protester. Let's have a look at what happened. And we also thought we'd remind you of a few other messy political encounters. Extraordinary. I forgot the green paint. We were just saying we just forgot the green paint with Peter Mandelson. Extraordinary stuff. Still to come on the Politics Hub tonight. Rishi Sunak has dusted off his Louis Vuitton wash bag. He's heading to the G20 summit in Delhi. On the agenda, accelerating progress on a free trade deal with India. Could the PM offer changes to immigration policy to get it over the line? That's next.
This is, of course, wonderful news for the orangutan conservation. Bornean orangutans declined by nearly 90% since the mid-70s. That's over the last 50 years. It's quite astonishing to estimate that more than 2,000 are being hunted single year. So it's wonderful news for the Bornean orangutans, but of course, fantastic news for all of us here, the staff, and for our visitors and supporters who can come into the zoo here in Chester and potentially see the little baby immediately. The new baby, though, is born to mum Sariki. She's a 39-year-old Bornean orangutan with her. It's her fourth baby. What's particularly significant is that Bornean orangutans normally only have a baby about once every 7 years. It's the lowest interbirth interval of any of the apes. So it really is a landmark. And so actually it's its brother, who was the last time we had a birth, which is 7 years ago, here at the zoo, Tomble. Yeah, it's a terrible litany of things actually that's gone on. I mean, firstly, the forest in Borneo is just disappearing. There is less of it left now. It's somewhere between 40 and 50% of it left. Certainly when I was a boy, Borneo is one of the last untouched paradises. People thought of it as an entire island of forest and exploration. That's no longer the case. Also, Orangutans live in lowland forests, that's forest near the coast, and much of the forest that's left is the most difficult forest to clear that's in the uplands, in the highlands, in the central Borneo. And that's cleared for a whole range of things. And obviously we're strongly advocating people buy products with sustainable palm oil. That's been one of the major drivers of deforestation, but also forest fires. And as much as the habitat loss, it's the hunting. We cannot take more than 2,000 of these animals out of the forest a year and expect the population to survive more than the next few decades. If you're actually then killing and poaching, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 a year, that is literally centuries worth of babies that are just being taken in every single year. I think it'll be a fair few weeks before we find out the sex of new baby and she starts to build a bit of confidence, and then perhaps we'll come back to you when we name it if you're interested.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. In a moment, we are going to be doing our own special preview to the Rugby World Cup. Don't worry, there's a point to it, don't worry. But first, another big coming together of leading nations. Rishi Sunak is heading to India for a G20 summit, where he will look once again to shore up international support for Ukraine and maybe even inch the UK closer to that all-important trade deal with India. Well, let's bring in Fiona and Caroline. I mean, Fiona, you've done a few summits in your time, haven't you? And how much kind of wheeling dealing is going on the sidelines?
Quite a lot, yeah. I remember the most interesting bilateral, if you like, or brush by, we call them. You remember the brush by, where it's not technically a meeting, but you just happen to walk past each other and do a bit of business on the side.
So is that choreographed then? Your advice is about, you may be walking down this corridor at this time?
I mean, messily so, but nevertheless, yes. And I was very, very stunned at the first, I think it was a G20 I went to in Hangzhou in China, the closeness of Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin. I was really struck by, really struck by. Everyone else was milling around doing their business, and those two were in a corner for at least 25 minutes speaking to each other. And it's really stayed with me since Putin went into Ukraine. She's no longer leader in Germany. The Nord Stream 2 that she had championed for such a long time now closed down. So for me, clearly there are those relationships which are not just everyday government-to-government relationships.
It's extraordinary.
Absolutely.
I mean, you must have done a few summits as well. You're a minister.
Yeah, I mean, I remember actually when my first ministerial post was the Home Office Minister, and I covered the Europe brief there as well, partly because I covered also organised crime. So, you know, crime respecting borders was part of, not respecting borders was part of the job. But I always remember when there used to be the sort of the council meetings, the Justice Home Affairs Council meetings, and David Blunkett was Home Secretary. I do recall that often he would have a dinner with his German equivalent, a guy called Otto Schily at the time, and Sarkozy was the French equivalent of a Home Secretary as well. So they would have a dinner, you know, like, and often David would then leave me to go to all the meetings and everything else like that. But it is about relationships. And again, when I was in that particular job, and I was there at the Home Office 2 years, I had when I first started going to some of the, the change to the European presidencies, you didn't know anybody. And you start to build relationships. And it is interesting how you can then pick up a phone to somebody and you have that personal connection. You might not always agree, but you have something in which to base the discussion on.
And never more is that connection more important, because the world is changing and it's changing rapidly. And we need to be able to work collaboratively, even with people we might think we don't particularly like very much. But it's necessary. If you look at what's happening in the global south, for example, you have China buying up a lot of critical minerals there, and that will impact on how we do our green transition. It will impact on our geopolitics. migration, for example.
On migration, because obviously the possible trade deal with India, one of the huge things is accepting more Indian visas or not. I mean, what kind of side of the argument do you come down on?
Look, I believe we need a managed migration system. So therefore, we need skills and we can organise them in a way that is to the benefit of our country, but also obviously individual benefit as well. That's in itself not a bad thing. I've never been against sort of migration strategy that is, planned in a way that we can benefit from. I think one of the issues here is how big that trade-off's going to be. Now, there's no doubt about it that India will be like, I think I heard a figure of something like 100,000 visas or something like that. I think for Rishi Sunak, the task will be if he accepts some of that, what conditions he's going to place on it that will be tight enough for him to justify it to his backbenchers and more widely the public.
Really interesting. Now, the Rugby World Cup starts tomorrow. When my producer Mark suggested this item, I have to be honest, I'm not a rugby fan, I'm more of a football girl. I wasn't completely sure where it was going, but I think it's important that we get away from the Westminster bubble sometimes on this show. So to try and help build anticipation, we thought we'd show you perhaps one of the most iconic moments of rugby in the last 20 years. I mean...
How old was that person he knocked down?
It doesn't look very
about
old
10.
to me. I think he was 10. Really? 10. Extraordinary. I just
it's a
can't believe
level of
that
competition or competitive spirit that is taken to a whole new level.
Yeah, it really is.
The ability to take on children.
Absolutely extraordinary. Any kind of embarrassing sporting moments for you guys, or...? I feel like there's a special Boris Johnson.
No children or animals were killed in the process.
It's like the golden
I have done something when it's sort of like a local kids football team where you're in the goal. They say, "Would you go in the goal and take some, some penalties from the kids and that thing?" And there's a bit of me sort of like, on the one hand, sort of want to be nice to the kids, but at the same time, I don't want to let in every goal that's going on, especially when it's being filmed.
Honestly, it's kind of
I just found out a fantastic rugby fact the other day. So I live in Blackheath, and apparently the first ever rugby match in the UK happened on Blackheath between England and Scotland.
There you go.
Who
We're
won?
going to take that. That is
Didn't
all,
ask the question
tonight.
Yeah.
There you go, rugby experts. Here we go on the panel. Remember, if you scan the QR code, you can catch up with all the latest on the Hub throughout the day. Thank you for joining us this evening, the very first week of the Politics Hub. We'll see you next time. Good night.